The ocean has a way of swallowing truth. One moment it is restless, a living, breathing beast that groans under the weight of its own power, and the next it is eerily calm, flat as polished glass, as though holding its breath. That night the water lay still beneath a sky choked with stars, and in the morning 42 men were gone. No cries had been heard, no splashes echoed across the decks. Their hammocks hung empty, their belongings untouched. And in the hearts of those who remained, a silent terror rooted itself, because they knew it wasn't chance that had taken them. It was a plan. You have to understand, pirates did not survive by luck. Luck was for gamblers and fools. The clever ones lived by strategy, by calculation, by understanding that the sea was not just water, but a stage, and every player on it had a role to perform. Those who controlled the script controlled the outcome. The crew of the Severance, a lean, blacked brigantine, with sails cut to slice wind like a knife, were no strangers to this kind of thinking. They had learned that strength was not only in the arm, but in the mind, in the preparation no one else saw. And that night, while the world above seemed calm, the Severance was already deep in the final act of a game its enemies never realized had begun. Health and strength at sea were not accidents. Pirates did not last long without understanding that their bodies were their most valuable weapon. Salted meat, dried beans, hardtack, these were rations everyone knew, but the smartest captains kept secrets in their storerooms. Citrus stolen from merchant holds, vinegar barrels to ward off the slow rot of scurvy, casks of fresh water buried under the ballast so the sun couldn't sour it. They preserved their health as carefully as they preserved gold, for they knew that a sick crew was already halfway to the gallows. You, had you been there, would have noticed the way they drank, sparingly, as though every swallow were an investment, and how they worked in the sun without collapsing, their bodies lean but never brittle. The captain of the Severance, known only as Reddin Locke, understood that power at sea was not about brute force. It was about endurance. How long you could stay sharp when others dulled. How long you could keep your men moving when the enemy was gasping for air. Locke fed his crew not just with food, but with discipline. He trained them in shifts so no man ever worked to exhaustion. He rationed rum as though it were medicine, doling it only when the weather broke a man's will. And he kept their minds sharp with the one thing no enemy could see, a shared purpose, whispered like scripture. That night, as the ocean lay quiet, this discipline paid its price. The Severance had been shallowed for 3 days by the Grey Marlin, a privateer ship hired by colonial governors to hunt them down. The Marlin's crew was bigger, their guns heavier, their pay higher. But they had a flaw, one Locke had been studying. Their watches grew lazy after sunset. They drank deep when the moon was full, and they believed, foolishly, that because they were the hunters, they were safe. You've likely heard that pirates attacked in daylight, sails full, cannons roaring, but Locke's plan was quieter, sharper. He understood that terror was most effective when the victim never saw the hand that dealt it. At the hour when men dream deepest, he sent his leanest swimmers overboard, men trained to move through water like shadows, lungs conditioned by months of cold dives for salvage. Their skin was greased to shed the chill, their teeth clenched around knives. They vanished into the black water without a ripple. What happened next is not written in any naval record, but the survivors told it later in whispers. One by one, the watchmen on the Grey Marlin disappeared from their posts. A hand would clamp over a mouth, a blade flash once in the moonlight, and the body would be pulled soundlessly over the rail into the dark. No shouts, no alarms, just absence spreading like a tide.
Below decks, men slept on, unaware that the crew above was being thinned like grain under a reaper's hand. By dawn, 42 men were gone. Those who woke found the Severance already a shadow on the horizon, sails taut, hull cutting away with the first breath of wind. The gray marlin drifted, leaderless, confusion curdling into fear, and somewhere out there, in the vast, unblinking silence of the sea, the ocean held its secret, because Locke and his men had not only struck without sound, they had vanished without trace, every movement hidden by the same discipline that kept them alive in storms and starvation. You might wonder what kind of man could orchestrate such a thing. The truth is, a man who understood that the greatest victories at sea were not won with cannons, but with control. Control over your crew, over your body, over the enemy's perception. Locke knew that the ocean itself could be a weapon if you learned how to wield it, and that night he proved it beyond doubt.
In the uneasy quiet that followed, the men of the Severance did not cheer. Victory at sea, especially the kind that left no powder smoke in the air, was not something to roar about. It was something to digest slowly, like a meal you knew had been hunted with care. They moved about the deck with deliberate precision, stowing ropes, securing gear, and tending to the small rituals that kept their ship from becoming a drifting coffin. You might have expected them to revel in the disappearance of 42 enemies, but they were pirates in the truest sense. Survival was the celebration. Reddin Locke paced the quarterdeck, his eyes scanning the horizon, not for enemies, but for changes, the subtle ripples of wind, the shift in the water's color, the kind of details only a man who had spent years on the open sea could read. His crew knew better than to interrupt him during these silent circuits. Locke had a mind that never stopped calculating. Even in calm seas, he anticipated storms. Even after decisive victories, he prepared for retaliation. The ocean taught that nothing stayed still for long. Part of his genius lay in the invisible layers of preparation that allowed moments like last night to unfold without error. The Severance's storerooms were not only stocked with food to ward off hunger, but with tools for deception, tar pots to blacken sails for night work, boards and planks sized to replace damaged rails in minutes, and bundles of dried herbs to burn, masking their scent from ships downwind. To you, these might seem like small details. To Locke, they were survival itself. It's easy to picture pirates as brutes drunk on rum and violence, but Locke's men were drilled in things most navies never considered. They practiced silent swimming until they could cross a ship's length underwater without surfacing. They learned how to fight in total darkness, using the feel of a man's breathing to guide their strikes. And above all, they learned patience, the art of waiting for the moment when an enemy's mind was weakest. You could almost say that last night's success began weeks before, when Locke first spotted the gray marlin and decided not to run, but to study. He had watched from a distance, charting their course by the stars, noting the intervals between their watch rotations. He saw how the officers strutted on deck during daylight, barking orders for show, but how their authority loosened under moonlight. Locke knew that arrogance at sea was a crack in the hull. It only took the right pressure to split it open. And so he pressured them without them realizing it, steering just within their sight, luring them into thinking the Severance was within their net. But for such a plan to work, the crew's health had to be unshakable. A single fever could wreck the timing. Locke ensured no man went underfed or overworked in the days leading up to the strike. Meals were small but fortified. Salt fish boiled with lemon rinds pilfered from a captured sloop, hardtack softened in vinegar, and dried figs preserved in honey. Every mouthful was chosen to keep muscles strong and minds alert. He ordered the men to bathe in the sea during midday calms, scrubbing salt and sweat from their skin to ward off the infections that could cripple a deckhand. You standing there on that deck might have thought it all excessive until you realized how much these measures kept the Severance one step ahead. Most ships were graveyards in waiting, their crews wasting away to scurvy and rot. Locke's men, lean and wiry, could haul a line twice as long and climb the rigging in half the time. That difference, invisible from a distance,
was lethal up close. The swimmers who vanished into the black water that night were not chosen by chance. They had been training for this for months without ever knowing the target. Each had been hardened by cold dives in northern currents, where the water bit like teeth and the dark pressed close against the eyes. They knew how to slow their breath, how to let their hearts beat like drums muffled under cloth. When the time came, they slipped into the water as if into another world, a place where sound could not betray them. And while the Grey Marlin's crew slept, the Severance's men became ghosts. They killed without rage, for rage was noisy. They moved like surgeons, each cut precise, each disappearance deliberate. It was this restraint, this absence of chaos, that left the survivors paralyzed with dread. For in the morning, the question was not just who had done this, but how had it been done without a trace. Locke understood that the human mind fears what it cannot see. By leaving no blood on the deck, no shouts in the night, he left his enemy to fight phantoms in their own imagination. And in the days to follow, long after the Severance had vanished into the open sea, the Grey Marlin's crew would find themselves waking in the dark, certain they heard water dripping from unseen hands, certain that somewhere below the surface, the ocean was still holding its breath.
The days that followed were a study in controlled movement. The Severance did not race away at full sail. That would have left too loud a wake, too clear a trail for the hungry ships that might be sent in pursuit. Instead, Locke kept the brigantine at a steady, almost lazy pace, tacking in broad arcs that would blur their path across the charts. Every turn was calculated to carry them through waters where currents played tricks on even the best navigators. If you had been aboard, you would have noticed how no one questioned his pace, because on a pirate ship under a captain like Locke, slowness could be more dangerous to an enemy than speed. The men were kept busy, but not in the way of merchant crews or naval draftsmen. Here, work was about readiness, not routine. They sharpened blades until they could shave the hair from an arm, checked crossbow strings, oiled pistol flints. Others tended to the more invisible weapons, the tarred ropes that would last longer under salt spray, the spare sails that could be hoisted without creak or groan. Locke believed that every sound a ship made was a signal, one the wrong ears could hear. Silence to him was a form of armor. Yet for all this discipline, the ship was not a grim place. In fact, there was a strange undercurrent of satisfaction among the men, a shared understanding that they had done something few crews ever could. They had struck a blow not just at the Grey Marlin, but at the idea that privateers were untouchable. That satisfaction was a kind of food in itself, one that kept a man's shoulders straight and his eyes sharp. Still, Locke never allowed his crew to drift into overconfidence. He knew the mind could turn soft faster than the body. To guard against this, he wove small tests into their days. Without warning, he would order the sails shifted in an unexpected pattern, or have the deck doused with seawater in the dead of night, forcing the men to move as though under sudden rain. He was training reflexes, keeping their senses alive to change. You, perhaps, might have called it paranoia. Locke would have called it survival. And survival was not only about readiness for combat. The sea could kill as easily with thirst as with steel, and Locke was meticulous in protecting a ship from it. Each man was assigned a ration of fresh water measured to the last drop. Rain was caught in stretched canvas and funneled into barrels scrubbed with sand and vinegar. To prevent the creeping taste of rot, the water was shifted between barrels every few days. Even the air in the hold was cared for. Vents opened and closed according to wind direction to keep the stores from souring. It was this attention to the smallest details that allowed the Severance to remain far from any friendly port for months at a time. While other crews withered under disease, Locke's men could fight at full strength long after their enemies had weakened. That imbalance, strong against weak, was the cornerstone of every plan he made. In the quiet hours of night, when most of the crew slept and only the watch kept their vigil, Locke would stand by the rail and study the stars. His hands rested on the worn wood, his eyes scanning the constellations, not as a poet might, but as a mathematician reading a map of invisible roads. The ocean to him was not endless chaos.
It was a vast, intricate machine, one whose levers and cogs could be felt through wind and current if you knew where to look. And somewhere out there, on those same waters, the gray marlin limped homeward. Word of their humiliation would spread in the ports like spilled rum, carried on the tongues of sailors who had never before feared shadows in the water. Every telling of the tale would grow a little darker, a little sharper, until the name Severance began to carry the kind of weight Locke had always sought. Not just fear of their cannons, but fear of their silence. That was the true prize of the operation. Not the gold that might have been taken, not the satisfaction of besting a rival, but the crafting of a legend. For at sea, a reputation could strike faster than a broadside. A ship that believed it was already doomed would make mistakes before the first shot was fired. You might think of it as a form of poisoning, not of the body, but of the will. Locke had just poisoned the will of every man who might one day be ordered to chase him. And so, as the Severance slid toward warmer waters, the men ate well, slept deep, and trained in ways they barely understood were training. Every cut of dried meat, every swig of clean water, every drill in the dark was another stroke in the painting Locke was making, not of the present, but of the future battle where these small choices would mean life or death.
The heat came slowly, like a predator stalking from the edge of the horizon. The air thickened, the light took on a molten quality, and the water lost its restless chop, settling into a slow, heavy roll. In this kind of weather, lesser crews began to unravel. Sweat made tempers short, the food seemed to spoil faster, and the body craved water long before the rations allowed. But aboard the Severance, the change was met with a quiet, practiced rhythm, because Locke had prepared them for this as surely as he had prepared them for battle. He shifted the work schedule so no man labored through the height of the day. Deck duties were performed in the early hours and late afternoons, when the sun sat lower, and the heat, though still oppressive, could be endured without sapping the strength from their limbs. Hammocks were strung in shaded spots, and the sails were angled to catch even the faintest breath of wind to keep the ship's air moving. You would have noticed how the men still worked in clean, unfrayed shirts, how their skin bore the marks of sun and salt, but not the raw, weeping sores that plagued crews on other ships. That was no accident. It was discipline, born from the knowledge that health was the truest form of power at sea. The food became lighter in the heat. Salted pork gave way to dried fish softened in seawater before cooking, and beans were boiled with vinegar to keep them from turning in the gut. Locke had arranged the stores so the freshest barrels were accessed in the warm months, and nothing that could rot was left where the sun could reach it. Even the ship's rum, that universal salve of seafarers, was thinned with lime juice, a bitter, bracing drink that warded off scurvy and dulled the craving for more than was wise. To the men, it was simply the captain's way. To Locke, it was the difference between a crew ready to fight and a deck of half-conscious shadows. Yet heat could do more than sap strength. It could loosen tongues. A careless word could spread like a stain, feeding doubt, breeding the kind of thoughts that led men to turn on one another. Locke countered this with a different kind of ration: stories. As the sun dipped, he would call the men to the quarterdeck, and there he would tell them of other ships, other captains, other tricks that had turned the tide of battle. These were not idle tales. They were lessons, hidden inside adventure, reminders of how cunning could outlast brute force. You, listening, would have felt the pull of it. The way a man's imagination could be anchored to a cause when it was fed with the right kind of fear and pride. It was during one such evening that a lookout spotted a lone sail on the horizon. The crew stiffened instinctively, but Locke's hand rose, steady and calm. Through the spyglass he studied the stranger. A merchant brig, fat-bellied with cargo, moving sluggishly in the heavy air. It was a tempting sight, the kind that would make a lesser crew's blood run hot. But Locke knew better than to lunge at prey without knowing who else might be watching. He let the brig drift in and out of view for the better part of a day, never closing the distance, never raising suspicion. This restraint gnawed at some of the younger men. Why let an easy prize slip away? Why starve when there was meat before you? But this was the same question the Gray Marlin's captain must have asked himself, and it had led to his ruin. Locke understood that patience was not the absence of action, it was the shaping of action to the perfect moment, and when that moment came, it would arrive like a knife in the dark. By the third day, the merchant ship's path bent toward an island, a low green hump on the sea, ringed with pale sand. Locke adjusted course ever so slightly, keeping to the shadow of the wind. The men moved quietly, the deck alive with a subdued anticipation. They were not chasing, they were shepherding. You could feel the shape of the trap, even if you didn't yet see its teeth. That night the ocean was unnervingly still again. It was not the same stillness as before, when 42 men vanished, but it had the same breathless quality, as if the sea itself were leaning in to listen. Lanterns were doused, the sails trimmed to whisper, and the Severance slid into the island's lee like a ghost returning to familiar waters. Somewhere out there the merchant brig was anchoring, her crew likely thinking only of rest. In the black water between them, the same swimmers who had worked their silent trade on the gray marlin prepared again. They carried not knives this time, but narrow saws wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Their orders were simple: cripple, not kill. The ocean's lessons were many, and one of the most valuable was this: that a ship unable to run was as helpless as a man unable to breathe. When they slipped over the side, there was no cheer, no send-off, just the faint ripple of bodies disappearing beneath the moonlight as the Severance seemed to hold its own breath. What happened next would decide whether the men would eat like kings or flee like hunted animals.
The water embraced the swimmers like a second skin, closing over their heads in a muffled darkness broken only by the fractured silver of the moon above. They moved with slow, deliberate strokes, never splashing, never breaking the surface more than a shadow would. In the heat-heavy stillness, every sound carried. A careless gasp, the scrape of metal on hull, could turn stealth into slaughter. But these men had been honed for this moment, their bodies tuned to the rhythm of patience and precision. The merchant brig lay at anchor, her hull broad and barnacled, her lines sagging with the weight of still air. The watch on deck moved lazily, leaning against rails, voices low with the complacency of men who believed danger was far away. That belief would be their undoing. The swimmers reached the ship's belly, fingers finding the warm, slimy grain of wood beneath the waterline. Wrapped saws bit into the anchor rope, thick, tarred hemp that resisted like muscle under a blade. The cuts were slow, careful, each stroke timed with the ship's faint creak until the fibers weakened. You might imagine the satisfaction of hearing the muffled snap, but there was no time for such indulgence. A second team worked at the rudder chains, their saws moving with the patience of surgeons. When the last link gave way, the brig was a crippled animal, still afloat, but unable to steer, unable to flee. It would drift wherever the current chose, and Locke already knew where that current led. Back aboard the Severance, the men kept to silence, their eyes fixed on the black outline of the brig. No attack came, no boarding hooks clanged against her hull. Locke had no interest in a noisy assault. He knew that fear ripened best in the dark, when a man could see nothing and imagine everything. Morning broke slow and thick, the air heavy with the smell of salt and warm wood. From their hiding place beyond the island's curve, the Severance crew watched as the merchant ship began to drift, her crew scurrying in confusion. Without her anchor, she could not hold position. Without her rudder, she could not turn to face the wind. She was at the mercy of the same sea her crew had thought they'd mastered. Locke waited, not for hours, but for the better part of a day. The sun climbed, burned, and began to fall before he gave the signal. By then, the merchant's crew would be thirsty, restless, their nerves fraying under the realization that they were moving, slowly but steadily, away from safety. Hunger and heat could unman the strongest sailor, and when their minds bent under that weight, the pirates would appear. When the Severance came into view, she did not rush. Her black sails were full but steady, her hull cutting through the water without spray. The effect was deliberate. It was the arrival of inevitability. There was no chase, no chance to run. The brig's crew gathered at the rail, their shouts thin and scattered. They could see the truth. Their ship could not escape. Locke hailed them without raising his voice. His words carried across the water like the toll of a slow bell. The choice was plain: surrender everything of value and live, or resist and feed the sea. No shots were fired, no steel flashed. Only the silent weight of inevitability pressed down on them until one by one they broke. The cargo, barrels of dried fruit, casks of wine, bolts of cloth, was ferried over in the longboats. The pirates worked quickly, their discipline as evident here as in battle. You might think the story ends here with a hold full of spoils and a crew flush with victory, but Locke's genius was not in the taking, it was in the leaving. The merchant ship was left afloat, still crippled, but with her crew alive to tell the tale. This, more than gold, was the currency Locke dealt in. Fear carried from port to port, sewn into the minds of sailors and captains alike. Every man who heard the story would imagine himself in that drifting hull, helpless as the black sails drew near. That night, the Severance sailed under a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. The men ate well, drank sparingly, and moved with the ease of a crew that knew they had done more than plunder. They had carved their name deeper into the marrow of the sea's stories. And somewhere far behind them, the crippled brig drifted, a dark seed of fear that would grow in every mind it touched. For Locke, it was not enough to survive the sea. One had to make the sea itself remember you. And in the silence of that night, as the water whispered along the hull, it seemed the ocean did.
In the weeks that followed, the Severance moved through the Caribbean like a rumor with teeth. Ports whispered of her before she arrived, and ships adjusted their courses rather than risk crossing her path. It was not just her black sails or her lean hull that unsettled them, it was the manner of her victories. She did not thunder in with cannonades, did not leave smoldering wrecks drifting in her wake. She came quietly, struck precisely, and left her enemies alive enough to speak. That restraint was more terrifying than slaughter, because it meant her captain chose exactly when and how his power was felt. Locke understood the psychology of the hunt as much as its mechanics. He knew men feared the unknown more than they feared death. Death ended fear, the unknown made it grow. By letting survivors tell their stories, how their rudders had been cut in the night, how their anchors had vanished, how their crews had been reduced without a sound, he created an aura around the Severance. The sea was wide, yet it began to feel smaller to those who sailed it, as if somewhere in every shadowed cove or moonless horizon, she was waiting. The crew thrived under this strange, quiet reign. They were sharper, stronger, more disciplined than most navies to boast. Their health was the keystone of Locke's strategy, and he guarded it with the same ferocity other captains reserved for treasure chests. Supplies were rotated and replenished with precision. Fresh food was seized from captured ships before gold was even counted. In every harbor, Locke sought not taverns, but traders. Those who dealt in citrus, vinegar, dried herbs, salted fish of the cleanest cut. To some, it seemed almost unpiratical, this obsession with provisions. But you, watching from the rail, would have seen its truth. The crew could march across decks in blistering sun, pull lines through sudden squalls, and swim through black water without faltering. Their strength made them unpredictable. They could vanish into the sea to strike unseen, or run at full sail for days without collapsing. Enemies never knew if the Severance would come from above the waves or below them. Locke made sure of that, drilling his men in every form of approach, boarding from the bow, swinging in from the rigging, or surfacing silently beside an enemy hull like predators rising from the deep. It was on a sweltering afternoon, heavy with the scent of distant rain, that the lookout spotted sails to the east. Through his glass, Locke recognized the lines of the vessel. A colonial frigate, armed and swift, the kind sent to make examples of pirates.
Most captains would have turned away, disappearing into the maze of islands. Locke, instead, ordered a change of course, not toward the frigate, but into the narrow channels of the nearby reef-studded shallows. The frigate followed. That was the trap. These waters were known to Locke like the lines of his own palm. He had studied them on stolen charts and tested them with careful passes, marking the hidden teeth of coral that could tear a ship's belly open. The Severance slid through them, with her sails trimmed just so, every rope and yard handled with silent coordination. The frigate, larger and less maneuverable, pressed on in pursuit, her captain eager for the kill. It was a game of inches. Locke led them deeper, where the channels narrowed and the sea's color shifted from deep blue to a deceptive turquoise. The crew worked without a word, eyes fixed on his signals, 2 fingers to port, a clenched fist to slow. The heat shimmered on the water, masking the pale flickers of coral beneath. Then came the sound, a hollow, tearing groan, followed by the scream of timbers. The frigate had struck. In that moment, the Severance did not turn to attack. It didn't need to. The frigate's momentum had done the work, lodging her fast against the reef. Locke brought his ship about just far enough for the crew to watch their enemies panic through the spyglass. Men running, pumps heaving, the white froth of water rushing in. Then he set the course away, vanishing into open water before the first longboats could be lowered. The message was clear. He could have destroyed them. He had chosen not to. And that choice, once again, would travel farther and last longer than any wrecked hull. It would whisper in every officer's ear. Chasing the Severance was not just dangerous, it was humiliating. That night, the crew dined on fresh fish caught in the shallows, grilled over coals and the galley's iron pan. The wind carried the scent across the deck, mingling with the faint sweetness of limes and the brine of the sea. They laughed softly, not in drunken revelry, but in the satisfaction of a clean victory. Somewhere out there, the ocean was carrying another story for them, another seed of dread planted in the minds of their enemies. And as Locke stood at the stern, watching the phosphorescence trail in the ship's wake, the ocean seemed to pulse with a silent acknowledgement. The sea did not reward recklessness, it favored the patient hunter. And on nights like this, when the water lay quiet beneath the stars, it felt as if the ocean itself was conspiring with him.